Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in this world. This is John West, back again with Japanese business and economy. Yes, as I said, this is John West, back again with Japanese business and economy. And now we're going to be looking at the second part of Class 3. We're continuing our examination of how Japan rose so quickly, Japan's rapid comeback after World War II, this high growth period of Japan from 1945 through to 1990. And in this lecture, I'm going to be looking at the role of Japanese companies. Now, traditional Japanese companies, especially in its high growth period from 1945 to 1990, had their own style. In many Western companies, staff members are individualistic, competing with each other. In Japan, teamwork, cooperation, helping your colleagues is much more common. In Japan, companies function a little bit more like families. Most staff members into big Japanese companies like Toyota, they're recruited as students directly from university. The recruiters are looking for the personality and the social activities of the students more than their grades. In fact, most students are recruited into a big company even before they've finished their final exams. The personality and social activities are very important because recruiters want new recruits to become part of the corporate team. Companies offer lots of in-house training to form company men. The university education is considered less important than the in-house training inside big companies. Each new recruit, known as a kohai in Japanese, is assigned to a senior, a senpai, and the kohai would follow the senpai around and watch everything he did, study everything he did as part of his training. In Japanese companies, especially in the past, there was a high degree of job security. It's very unlikely that anyone would ever get fired. And in fact, in big Japanese companies, like Toyota and so on, new recruits were offered lifetime employment. So you might start your career at the age of 22 when you graduate, and you stay there in that company right through to the age of 60. Now, companies are very happy to, or were very happy to provide this job security and very often lifetime employment because they want to benefit from the training they give to staff. They don't want to train staff and see them run off to another company. The whole spirit of staff-company relationships in Japan is a high degree of loyalty. Staff don't get fired, and so they feel very committed and loyal to the company, and so they're very happy to work hard. Most Japanese staff, particularly professional staff members, work very long hours. They do lots of unpaid overtime. Unfortunately, karoshi, death by overwork, has been and remains a problem in Japan. It's a tragedy. How are we paid in Japan? In Japan, we don't have a merit-based pay like in an American company. Pay rises are granted based on seniority. Every year, each person gets a pay rise based on their seniority. In your career working for a big Japanese company, you can expect to be rotated around to different parts of Japan and even different parts of the world. One day, the personnel department might ring you up in your office in Tokyo and say, "Hey, Yasu, we've just transferred you to Osaka." Or they may say, "Hey, Yasu, I've just transferred you to Singapore." This is all part of corporate life in Japan, rotations around the company. This is important because The company needs staff in its various offices in different parts of Japan, and also its various offices throughout the world. But also, this is also part of the training, the learning experience that staff go through in working for a Japanese company. A very important part of corporate teamwork in Japan is socializing and drinking with colleagues after work. It looks fun in that photo, drinking with our colleagues. But some of the people in that photo would have families at home, wife and children at home waiting for them, and they're forced to go out drinking and socializing with colleagues because the company wants them to have team building experience, to foster corporate teamwork. An important aspect of these socializing and drinking sessions with colleagues is what we call non-communication. And the idea of the word non-communication really means communication through drinking. And so in the office, Japanese people may not express their points of view very openly, very directly, but in the drinking sessions after work, they are free to say whatever they want, get things off their chest. And so this is very important for bonding and teamwork. Now, the typical Japanese company, unlike Rakuten, which we've seen before, the typical Japanese company, particularly in the high growth period from 1945 to 1990, would have very few foreign staff. All of their staff members will be recruited in Japan and be Japanese. This is very different from global enterprises like Apple and other big American companies, which have very international staffs, with recruits from all parts of the world and all around the world. And so, of course, it's very different from Rakuten, which we saw before. Rakuten now has staff members from Europe, America, and India. In a Japanese company, a white-collar worker is known as a salary man. I can't pronounce it with a Japanese accent. I hope you'll forgive me. But salary man is Japlish, an English word imported into the Japanese language. Women were typically known as office lady, or OL. And you can see in this photo the type of work that office ladies often did, pouring coffee for a salary man who's working on his computer. Now, unfortunately, back in the old days, the high growth period of Japan, there was very little place for professional women. The women who were hired into companies, they were OL, and they would mainly do pink collar tasks, typing and photocopying. So you see here in this little picture, the white collar worker, he's the salary man, and so he's a typical office worker. A blue collar worker, who's more of a tradesman or a factory worker, and a pink collar worker, the lady. Now, sexual harassment is a problem in all countries of the world, but particularly in Japan, particularly in these old days when women were mainly doing pink collar work, sexual harassment, or as the Japanese say, sekahara, was a great problem. Now, back in the old days, particularly, when women got married and became pregnant, they were typically expected to leave work and look after the home. When the children had grown up, they might then return to work, but often then, at that time, in a part-time position, again, doing pink collar work. Now, please have a look at this chart. It's very important and very interesting. Now, if you look at the red line, these lines show women's labour participation by age. So if you look at the red line, from the age of 15 to 19, you have this sharp increase. This is Japanese women being hired into a company. Then around 20 to 24, what happens is the Japanese woman gets married, has a baby, and then retires from work. And so the line goes down. And it stays down for a while, and the line moves back up again slowly as the children go to work, go to school, as the children go to work, and the woman returns to the workforce. Now, this is what we call the M curve. And you'll see back in 1975, the M curve was quite sharply M. Over the years, the downward movement in the M has softened. And you can see there the figure for 2014, it's only a very soft M. And what this tells us is that less and less these days are women retiring from work when they get married and have a baby. Women are more likely to stay in the workforce now than they used to do. Now, this is a change in the nature of women's participation in the workforce that we'll discuss in detail, perhaps next week when we look at womenomics. Now, in the previous lesson, we discussed how the Japanese government protected its infant industries. And we explained how the Japanese government provided protection against imports, protection against foreign investment, and so on. Now, this development strategy of the Japanese government, it is put together, it is conducted in a fairly particular way. And we say that this development strategy was engineered by an iron triangle of business, bureaucrats, and politicians. And so what happens is the business people would get together with government bureaucrats and with politicians to work out which industries would be protected, how they would be protected, and who would enjoy the benefits of this protection. And of course, everything would be behind closed doors. Now, the point of talking about this in a little bit of detail now is to say that the traditional Japanese company always had very close relations with government, very close relations with government in the organisation and design of the government's industry protection strategy. Now, one part of this iron triangle process is what we called amakudari, or descent from heaven. Now, what happens is senior government officials who are working with companies in the private sector and maybe providing them with favours, providing them with assistance. These senior government officials, when they retire, might be rewarded by a company with a job as a senior advisor in the company. And the word amakudari, or descent from heaven, refers to the fact that senior government officials might descend from their government position into a company position after having helped that company through assistance or protection or other things. And so the jobs of government officials in the private sector are typically rewards for favours granted to a company. In addition to that, however, once a government official is part of a company, that person is still expected to help make the iron triangle function. So if a Japanese company would like a favour or assistance from the government, this former government official, this now senior advisor, would be expected to work on behalf of the company to convince government bureaucrats to provide a favour. Now, when you hear my story about amakudari and these close relations between government officials and companies, it's not surprising to learn that Japan has a long history of corporate corruption scandals. It's had a long history of companies expecting favours from the government, and the companies then giving kickbacks to government officials. Now, in Japan, business meetings are a little bit different from they might be in America or in Australia. Typically in Japan, business meetings are ceremonial. Everything is decided before. And what happens is that junior staff get together with their counterparts in other parts of a company, or get together with their counterparts in other companies, and they work out what their bosses might be willing to agree to. In other words, everything is pre-cooked. And in Japan, this process of preparing in detail all decision-making before we get to official meetings. This is known as nemawashi. The term nemawashi in Japan means preparing the roots for transplanting. So this is a very important part of Japanese business practices. Senior leaders, CEOs and directors general and so on, they don't want any surprises when they're in a big meeting. They want everything to be sewn up, everything to be prepared before, and the junior staff would be called upon to get this organized. Many years ago, I had a Japanese boss, and we might have an important issue to deal with. He'd say to me, "West, go out and do some nemawashi and get everything organized for me." And so he didn't want to be involved in all the dirty work of arguing, debating, deciding, and so on. He wanted everything worked out ahead for him. Now, as I said earlier, Japanese men, particularly in the old days, but still to a large extent now, they might start job in a company like Toyota at the age of 22, and then they work in this company until the age of 60. They have perfect job security, no problem. They're married to their company, and everything's fine and secure for them. Now, when it comes to the age of 60, a Japanese man then retires. He goes back home to his family. Now, after being married to a company for 30 or 40 years, he discovers his family again. Maybe he doesn't know his wife that well anymore. Maybe he doesn't know his children that well anymore. But he says, "Darling, I'm back. I've retired. I've come back home." Now, during this period of time, many Japanese wives have created independent lives for themselves, going shopping with their girlfriends, going on overseas trips with their girlfriends. Some Japanese women refer to their retired husbands as industrial waste. Now, this is not a very friendly way to refer to a husband, but sometimes this happens apparently. Now, Japanese men, like this gentleman in the photo, when they retire, often they don't know what to do with their lives. They spend so much of their life working very hard, working for the company, going out drinking with colleagues and so on. So sometimes Japanese men are lost when they retire. So what do? Very often they just find another job. And if you speak to taxi drivers in Japan, you'll notice that taxi drivers are typically between the age of 70 and 75. And so often they might be a former company man or government official who retired, didn't know what to do, so gets a job as a taxi driver. Also, many professors in Japan actually are retired people who just get a job as a professor for something to do. Now, what I've described here is the typical situation in Japanese companies during the period 1945 to 1990. And not every company was exactly the same as that, but overall that was the general situation. Now, as we've discussed or mentioned briefly, from the early 1990s, Japan had a financial crisis. From the early 1990s, Japan started to change in many ways. And in the coming classes, we're going to look at the ways that Japan has changed dramatically. But I'd like to just mention a few ways in which Japan has changed. One way in which Japan has changed dramatically is that there is now less full-time and less lifetime jobs than there used to be. In the old days, everyone would go from university or technical college, join a company, and work there for the whole career. That is less the case now. And as you see in this graph, there's a growing number of what we call irregular workers, workers on short-term contracts or workers on part-time contracts. And of course, now in the period since the 1990s, Japanese companies are looking more for flexibility in their staff than loyalty. But we'll go into this in more detail in the coming classes. Another trend that is taking place, which is another new development, is that companies are becoming a little bit more international. We've seen in the case of Rakuten, which is actually quite international. Most Japanese companies are not as international as Rakuten, but most companies are actually hiring staff from overseas countries. And that's for two reasons. With Japan's aging population, there are staff shortages, worker shortages in many companies. So companies are often looking around for staff from other countries to fill the empty vacancies. Another thing is that Japanese companies are now much more international than they used to be. Foreign investment and international trade are much more important. So having a diverse workforce in a company is very important for selling and doing business in foreign markets. The other trend that we're going to be looking at in the coming classes is that there are now more and more women in professional jobs in Japan. There's still not a lot, but there is a growing number. This is what we've called womenomics. So Japan has been changing, and in the coming classes, we're going to look at in more detail these changes in Japan, and of course, how Japan must change much more in the future. Now, as this little video I'm going to show you highlights, Japan still needs to change greatly to be a more efficient, more dynamic economy.
Working long hours is a way of life in Japan, so much so that some occasionally die from it. Karoshi is a term that means death by overwork. So why are people working so hard, and can it be fixed? Japan has some of the longest working hours in the world. Nearly a quarter of Japanese companies have their employees work more than 80 hours of overtime per month. Those extra hours are often unpaid. Today, Japan's corporate culture is driven by the so-called salaryman. The salaryman is defined by his loyalty to his company and expected to spend his entire career working for the same firm. Not only does he work long hours in the office, but it's also assumed he'll participate in after-work activities too, like drinking with colleagues. And they're not taking enough time off. In 2017, one survey found that despite being entitled to 20 days off per year, Japanese workers left 10 of those days unused, topping every other country in the survey. You don't have to be in the confines of corporate walls to feel the impact of its work culture. It's 3 a.m. Thursday morning right now in Tokyo. I'm in the area of Ginza. Every few minutes I see a man wearing a suit, holding a briefcase. The nation's work ethic dates back to what's referred to as Japan's economic miracle, which was its dramatic economic growth beginning in the 1950s, which propelled it to become the world's second largest economy. Inside Japan's corporations, the culture emphasizes the success of a company as a whole to be more important than any single individual, which might explain why one study found that 63% of Japanese felt guilty for taking paid leave. But perhaps more concerning is this: long work hours don't necessarily mean high productivity. In fact, Japan has the lowest productivity amongst the G7 nations. Earlier, I mentioned the term karoshi. It means death by overwork. It's legally recognized by the government and usually is marked by a heart attack, stroke, or suicide due to stress. There's hundreds of cases of karoshi reported annually, although some argue these cases are underreported and that the real number could exceed that by up to 10 times. An employee of the advertising firm Dentsu jumped to her death in 2015. The cause was said to have been depression caused by overwork. The case generated widespread attention and renewed calls to change the long working hours and illegal unpaid overtime, highly common in Japan. The firm was fined for violating labor standards because she was reportedly forced to work more than 100 hours of overtime per month. The company's CEO even resigned over the controversy. After the death, Dentsu made some changes within the company. One of them, the lights in the office now turn off at 10 p.m. every night in an effort to force employees to leave. Both the government and companies are now actively trying to reduce the number of working hours here. And there are some early signs of hope. Japan's government has considered several initiatives to curb the number of hours spent at the office, including making it mandatory to take at least 5 vacation days a year and requiring a rest period between the end of one day and the start of another. In 2016, a new holiday, Mountain Day, was started, bringing Japan's number of annual public holidays to 16. And in 2017, the government launched an initiative called Premium Fridays, in which it encouraged companies to allow their employees to leave at 3 p.m. on the last Friday of the month, promoting consumer spending and less time in the office. But one study found that less than 4% of employees in Japan actually left early on the first Premium Friday, which is why, despite these initiatives, a cultural challenge still looms. Since Japan's culture emphasizes the group over the individual, well, no one wants to be the first one to leave the office. And there's another reason that there's pressure on people to work hard. Japan's economy is in danger, and in order to maintain its massive size, Japan needs to put in the hours. Japan lost its spot as the world's second largest economy to China in 2011, a title that it had previously held for 42 years. Japan is dealing with a labor crisis. Its population is aging fast, and its birth rate is in decline. That means its total population is going down. And in the next 50 years, it's projected to shrink by nearly a third. The population is expected to go from 127 million in 2015 to just 88 million by 2065. There's two likely ways that a nation can compensate for the labor shortage: immigrants or robots. Japan has always been less inclined to accept immigrants. In fact, its percentage of foreign workers is tiny compared to other nations of large economies. So without more immigrants, it's looking to robotics to fill in the gap. Its robotics industry has spanned from hospitality to manufacturing, and now even reaching farms by creating robots that milk cows. But whether technology could open the door for a better work-life balance for Japan's workforce still remains to be seen. Hey guys, it's Upton. Thanks for watching. For more of our videos, check.
So there's a fascinating little video about work life in Japan. So this brings an end to our examination of the role of Japanese companies in Japan's rapid economic development after World War II. Now, the specific style of traditional Japanese companies contributed greatly to Japan's high growth period. The concept in Japanese companies was based on cooperation among staff members rather than competition between them, a relationship of loyalty between staff members and the company, and very hard-working, dedicated Japanese staff members. So I think for this period, for 1945 through to 1990, these characteristics of traditional Japanese companies were very positive. But looking ahead, Japanese companies really need to reinvent themselves and reform themselves. They need to reform their work practices, because the challenge that Japan faces today is to lift its productivity to the levels of other advanced countries. And to do this, much work has to be done, and many reforms need to take place, both at the level of governments and companies themselves. So, thank you once again for spending these few moments with me. It's been great to have you with me as we look at the role of Japanese companies in Japan's rapid post-war economic development. If you have any questions, comments, reactions, please send me an email. I'd be delighted to receive it. And of course, in mid-January, we're going to have our student discussion groups. We can discuss these issues together. And so for the moment, let me say all the very best to you. And I look forward to seeing you next time.